This is the second of two videos of the third part of an introduction to Judaism, this third part dealing with the importance of study in the Jewish tradition. And it's in this second video that I'll now directly address the issue of the importance of study in Judaism. So study is one of the most important commandments, mitzvot in Hebrew, one of the most important commandments of the Jewish tradition. And the term for the commandment is Talmud Torah. Talmud here literally means study. Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. And Torah is, of course, the central term of the Jewish tradition. Torah, and specifically can refer to the 5 books of Moses, more broadly to Judaism as a whole, the Jewish tradition, and in the broadest sense, wisdom of a universal nature. But we have two kinds, but Torah, the literal meaning of the term is again guidance, instruction. And we have two kinds of guidance, instruction in the Jewish tradition. Two kinds of Torah, guidance, instruction. Law, what we call halakha, and non-legal material, agadah, that we call agadah, moral, philosophic, spiritual teachings. So the commandment to study Talmud Torah encompasses all of these various kinds of guidance and instruction. So the commandment to study Talmud Torah is one of the most central commandments of the Jewish tradition. Now, we as traditional Jews do not live by the Hebrew Bible as it's written. We live by the Hebrew Bible as it's interpreted and understood according to the Jewish tradition. And so this commandment of the study of Torah is a central commandment, as I say, of our tradition. It's not to be found in the plain meaning of the Bible. So if we go back to the Bible, there are various verses that talk about the importance of study or learning. For example, there's verses that talk about teaching children words of Torah. And even though the word Torah doesn't actually appear in the verses, that's the intent. Teaching children words of Torah, giving them instruction, guidance. Or that we're to meditate upon words of Torah. And again, even though the word Torah may not appear, that's the intent of meditating upon words of Torah day and night. Okay, there are various verses like that, okay, where we can talk about the importance of studying the Bible. But what's being talked about is again guidance of a moral and spiritual nature, or a legal nature, but moral and spiritual guidance in the main, okay? The commandment of Talmud Torah, according to the Jewish tradition, which isn't found in the plain meaning of the Bible, we're talking about a highly intellectual experience. And I'm using the word here, experience, intentionally. This is a religious experience of sitting and studying texts in a rigorous way, rigorous intellectual study of text, to sit and study text. This is the essence of Talmud Torah, of the study of Torah in the Jewish tradition. This is not to be found in the plain meaning of the Bible. The rigorous intellectual study, intellectual development. Okay, this is not to be found in the Bible, in the plain meaning of the Bible. Okay, now, we have a saying that this commandment is so central in the Jewish tradition of Talmud Torah. We say it's keneged kulam, it's equivalent to all of the other commandments. Okay, even though it's not found in the plain meaning of the Bible. This is regarded as a law of the Bible, a law of the 5 books of Moses, because again, we live not by the 5 books of Moses or by the Bible as written. We live by the 5 books of Moses and the Bible as understood according to tradition. And according to tradition, this commandment of Talmud Torah, of studying Torah, is a commandment regarded as from the Bible, even though it's not in the plain meaning of the Bible. By contrast, prayer in Judaism, prayer is, there's a debate whether prayer is a commandment of the 5 books of Moses or of the Bible. It's a debate, okay? But according to all opinions, the formal prayers that we pray in Judaism, in our synagogues and from our prayer books, the formal prayers of Judaism that we pray are, according to all opinions, a rabbinic requirement, not biblical law, which means they're of a less severe nature. And we certainly don't say of prayer it's equivalent to all of the other commandments as we do of the study of Torah. So the study of Torah, according to all opinions, is biblical law, and we say of it that it's equivalent to all of the other commandments. Okay? One last thing in regard to the importance of study in the Jewish tradition. And that is William James, the great American psychologist, philosopher who lived in the late 19th, early 20th century. William James was very interested in religion. And one of his major works is called The Varieties of Religious Experience, in which he delineates various kinds of religious experience. He's not interested in theology, philosophy. Religious experiences, such as prayer, meditation, mystical experiences. And he delineates various kinds of religious experience, and one thing is glaringly absent, in my view, from the book, and that is study, which I think reflects a bias against Judaism, not intentionally on the part of William James. I think he simply was not familiar with Jewish culture and the Jewish religion. But study in Judaism is a religious experience. It's, again, sitting and studying texts, and just as in prayer, we have a place for prayer that's sacred, and a special place that's designated for prayer, that's the synagogue, okay? But we can pray anywhere. But we do have a sacred place that's special for prayer, the synagogue, even though we can pray anywhere. So too with study. We have a sacred place for study. That's the yeshiva. The yeshiva were the rabbinical academies, study academies that emerged in the Talmudic period and exist to this day. Okay, and within the yeshiva, you have the study hall, which is in Hebrew the Beit Midrash, the study hall. So it's the study hall, the yeshiva, that's the central place of study, of sitting and studying text, in a rigorous intellectual study of text. This is a religious experience, and we can study anywhere, but the central place, the sacred place, and a yeshiva, Beit Midrash, is even more sacred according to the Jewish tradition than a synagogue, because again, the study of Torah is even more important than prayer. So that this is something that's glaringly absent from William James' discussion of various kinds of religious experience, that he doesn't delineate study, which is, you could say, the central religious experience of the Jewish tradition. Okay? That's in terms of the importance of study within the Jewish tradition in a general way. Now what I want to do is to go back to an ancient Talmudic source in which is reflected the importance of study or the nature of study in the Jewish tradition. There's a Talmudic debate, Talmudic source in which there's a debate. Which is greater, study or good deeds? Okay, and the word used for study is Talmud. Okay, now Talmud today is often used, generally it's used to refer to the Talmudic literature, especially the Babylonian Talmud. Remember, we have two Talmuds in Judaism, the Babylonian and the Jerusalem. So when we speak of the Talmud in general, without specifying, we mean the Babylonian Talmud. That's the authoritative Talmud for a variety of reasons that I won't go into. If we speak of the Jerusalem Talmud, we'll specify Jerusalem Talmud. But when we speak of the Talmud, we're speaking of the literature, the Babylonian Talmud, this piece of literature. Okay, that's Talmud today. Or we use an interchangeable term, Gemara. Now, this is highly significant in going back to this Talmudic debate, which is greater study or good deeds. The word used is Talmud and not Gemara. Okay, because in the Talmudic period there was a distinction between the two terms. Gemara, both of these are methods of study. Okay, and Gemara was study on the basis of tradition, something handed down by tradition, that we learn by tradition. Talmud is learning on the basis of reasoning, principles of logic. So that when the Talmud is juxtaposing to good deeds, Talmud, study, the study that's being spoken of here, juxtaposed to good deeds in this debate, is study of a highly intellectual nature, rigorous intellectual study on the basis of principles of logic, reasoning. So that actually this debate, in my view, is reflecting the encounter between Judaism and the ancient Greek culture. We could say Jerusalem and Athens. Okay? these are really, can be seen, Jerusalem and Athens as two pillars of the larger Western culture that we live in. Jerusalem, the intention is the Hebrew Bible. Good deeds represents Jerusalem, the Hebrew Bible, because good deeds is the essence of religion in the biblical conception. Again, in the biblical conception, the essence of religion is not faith, it's not ritual, it's morality. In keeping with the verse in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 18, and you should do that which is right in the good. You should do that which is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. Righteousness, goodness, morality. Ritual has secondary importance. Okay? So when we're talking about good deeds in this source, we're talking about good deeds in a moral sense, faithful to the biblical conception, that the essence of religion in the biblical conception is morality. Okay? Talmud is principles of logic, that these principles of logic that were used, that are the essence of Talmud in the Talmudic literature. Talmud is distinguished from Gemara. Gemara is learning by tradition. Learning Talmudic learning is in essence reasoning, principles of logic. And these principles of logic that were used to study our sacred literature, the Bible, were borrowed from the surrounding Greek culture during the Hellenistic period when the Greek culture spread throughout the ancient Near East. So that in juxtaposing Talmud, two good deeds, which is greater, the Talmud is asking, principles of logic, intellectual development, or morality. This is really an encounter of Judaism and ancient Greece. Parenthetically, we had two great encounters between Judaism and ancient Greece in our tradition, in our history. The first is in the Talmudic period. The second is later in the Middle Ages, following the Talmudic period. So in the Talmudic period, this encounter, the Talmudic rabbis incorporated three things into Judaism. Okay? And I think that each of the three things reflects Judaism's orthoprax nature, correct deeds, the emphasis, pragmatic emphasis on deeds. By the way, notice in this source, which is greater, study or good deeds? Okay, there's an orthoprax emphasis here that we'll see in the source. Okay, much like I discussed in the second part of my introduction to Judaism, which the second part dealt with the question of what is the essence of Judaism, faith or good deeds. In the debate within the Jewish tradition, which is greater, what is the essence of Judaism, faith or good deeds, both sides of the debate are in agreement that good deeds are a necessary component of a religious life. The debate is to what extent faith is a necessary component, and that reflects Judaism's orthoprax nature, or the emphasis on deeds. Okay, so too here, both sides will see an emphasis on deeds. Which is greater, study or deeds? There will be a pragmatic emphasis in both opinions that we'll see, reflecting Judaism's orthoprax nature. So also when the Talmudic rabbis incorporated three things from the Greek culture, what these three things that I'll in a moment delineate, these three things have in common is they're compatible with an orthoprax emphasis on deeds. The first thing that they incorporated were democratic principles and values, which are moral values. Okay, so that in the Jewish law, we have a principle, democratic principle, when there's debate between two or more rabbinic authorities, they disagree about the law, the will of the majority decides what the law is. Okay, when in the judicial system, in our judicial system in Judaism, a rabbinic court, no rabbi or rabbinical judge in a rabbinical court, no rabbinical judge can judge alone in an anti-democratic, authoritarian way. Now that's often done today in modern Western societies that are considered democratic. Judges rule in courts of law alone, in an anti-democratic, authoritarian way. Not so in Judaism. Minimum of 3 judges, so that the will of majority will decide if there's debate and disagreement among the judges regarding their ruling. So, and then also, okay, so that's democratic principles that the Talmudic rabbis borrowed from the surrounding Greek culture. They also, secondly, incorporated argument debate as a way of learning. Okay, and that leads to pluralism, a plurality of viewpoints regarding virtually every issue in the Jewish tradition. Argument, debate. the famous joke, any two Jews in a room, you have three different opinions, that characterizes the Talmud and the Jewish tradition based on the Talmud, is pluralism. And pluralism is itself a democratic value, so that the argument and debate that leads to intellectual development in Judaism is within an atmosphere of commitment to democratic values of pluralism, mutual respect, tolerance. Okay? And then third, what the rabbis incorporated were principles of logic that were used to study biblical texts. But again, that's subordinate to the study of the Bible, where the essence of religion in the Bible is good deeds. Okay? Also in argument debate, the rabbis were arguing, debating over issues of law, issues, moral, spiritual, philosophic issues that are connected to how we live as Jews. Okay? So all three of these things that the rabbis incorporated from the Greek culture, democratic principles and values, argument and debate as a method of study, principles of logic to study biblical texts or sacred literature. All of these things are compatible with an orthoprax conception. What the rabbis, the Talmudic rabbis, did not incorporate into Judaism is systematic philosophy of a theoretical, abstract nature. That is in the second encounter between Judaism and ancient Greece that took place in the Middle Ages, where medieval Jewish philosophers incorporated systematic philosophy into Judaism, even though the Talmudic rabbis didn't incorporate systematic philosophy in Judaism. Medieval philosophers begin to do that. It becomes, this is when we see the emergence of a kind of orthodox orientation emerges in Judaism, an emphasis on theology, systematic philosophy. So medieval Jewish philosophers incorporate systematic philosophy into Judaism. But the Talmudic rabbis did not incorporate systematic philosophy into Judaism. So now, to go back then to this debate in the Talmud, which is greater, study or good deeds? The debate here is really Jerusalem and Athens. Good deeds, faithful to the biblical conception that the essence of religion is morality, versus study from the Greek culture, an influence of the Greek culture, intellectual development, study on the basis of principles of logic. So the first opinion in this Talmudic source is Rabbi Tarfon, one of the great Talmudic rabbis. And Rabbi Tarfon is very faithful to the Bible. He says more important is good deeds. Okay, faithful to the Bible. And Rabbi Akiva comes and says, one of the great Talmudic rabbis, and Rabbi Akiva says, Talmud is greater, study. And this is shocking, because intellectual development, again, is not to be found as a value in the plain meaning of the Bible. And he apparently takes a kind of Greek view, Rabbi Akiva, that study is the essence of Judaism. The rabbis then say, like Rabbi Akiva, they say study is greater than good deeds, but they say study is greater, paradoxically, because it leads to good deeds. So notice, the rabbis are faithful at this. While they speak of intellectual development as being greater, there's a paradox here. Paradoxically, they speak of intellectual development, a Greek value, as being more important than good deeds. But what's the reason? Because it's a means to leading to good deeds, the essence of religion and the biblical conception. So that ultimately they're faithful to the biblical conception. Now, the question that stands out here in this source is whether the rabbis, in saying that Talmud is greater, like Rabbi Akiva, are agreeing with Rabbi Akiva, or are they disagreeing with Rabbi Akiva? Are they interpreting his intent and agreeing with him, or are they disagreeing with him? In my view, it's very clear they agree with Rabbi Akiva, and they're interpreting his intent, because this is the very same Rabbi Akiva who, in speaking about the essence of Judaism, pointed to the biblical verse, the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18, love your neighbor as yourself. Rabbi Akiva is very, very faithful to the biblical conception. The essence of religion is good deeds. And therefore the rabbis are interpreting Rabbi Akiva that Talmud, study of Torah, is greater only in a paradoxical sense, that it leads to the ultimate goal of religion in the biblical conception of good deeds. So that again, both sides of this debate, then Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis on the other side, are in agreement that good deeds is a necessary component of a religious life. The question is to what extent intellectual development is necessary. For Rabbi Tarfon, it's not necessary, at least faithful to the biblical conception, where in the biblical conception, intellectual development isn't an ideal or a value at all. It's a value that comes from the Greek world. And so Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, in holding that study is more important than good deeds, are still nevertheless faithful to the orthoprax conception or orthoprax nature of Judaism and biblical religion, that the ultimate goal of religion is good deeds, morality, and the intellectual development is because it leads to morality. Okay? So that's the Talmudic source. Now, one last thing that I want to add here in this video. The Hasidic movement is a movement that's a part of a larger mystical stream in Judaism. The Hasidic movement emerged in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, and it's part of a larger, as I say, mystical stream in Judaism. It's a form of mysticism. Now, mysticism in general, not only in Judaism, in all cultures, what characterizes mysticism more than any other thing is that mystics conceive of the essence of religion as a very personal experience, what we would call in the Western world enlightenment. Okay? This is in contrast to the biblical conception of religion, that the biblical conception of religion, the essence of religion is again good deeds. Okay? Morality. And morality is social in nature. It's our relationship with our fellow human being. So that the essence of mystical conceptions, the essence of religion is a very personal experience of what we would call enlightenment in the Western world. In Hasidic Judaism, a form of Jewish mysticism, the term used is not enlightenment. The term that would be used is cleaving unto God. But cleaving unto God, morality then, social in nature, is necessary in order to be able to cleave unto God, and it's a necessary result of cleaving unto God. This is very characteristic of mystical views, where morality can be seen as a means to achieve enlightenment and a necessary result resulting from enlightenment. So too in Hasidic Judaism. Morality is a means, a necessary means perhaps, to achieve cleaving unto God, and cleaving unto God will necessarily result in a moral life. So, but this is the Hasidic Judaism, a kind of mystical version of Judaism. It's a movement that emerged in the 18th century, and it was a highly revolutionary movement, so that in its origins. And the revolution was actually against the highly intellectual nature of Talmudic Judaism. Because in the Talmud, there's this tremendous influence from the Greek culture on Talmudic learning, Talmud in its essence, principles of logic, reasoning, intellectual development. Okay, to such an extent that Hillel, also one of the greatest Talmudic teachers, expresses a view. He lives prior to Rabbi Akiva, but it's very similar to the view of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, again, that Talmud study is greater than good deeds, but paradoxically because it's a means leading to good deeds. Okay? So Hillel presents also in the Talmud a very similar view. Hillel says that an ignorant person cannot be truly pious, and the word for pious is chassid, which is the word Hasidic, the name of the movement, this mystical movement in Judaism emerged in the 18th century, comes from this word meaning chassid, pious. So Hillel says an ignorant person cannot be truly pious or truly God-fearing. In the biblical conception, God-fearing, this is a biblical concept, God-fearing. In the biblical conception, that's morality, God-fearing. There's a verse in the book of Proverbs that says that the fear of God is to hate evil. It's the hatred of evil. To fear God is to hate evil. And it's morality. So that Hillel says an ignorant person cannot be truly pious, truly God-fearing. So the Hasidic movement was a revolution against such an intellectual approach in two ways. Number one, the Rebbe, the leader of Hasidic of the Hasidic movement, the leaders, were called Rebbe and not Rabbi. Rabbi is a Talmudic term, it means teacher. But the Talmudic teacher, Rabbi, is a teacher by virtue of learning, scholarship. This is a very learned person. Okay, and by virtue of learning is a leader, a religious leader, spiritual leader. The Rebbe of Hasidic Judaism is a leader not by virtue necessarily of learning. The Rebbe may be a learned person, but that's the Rebbe is a leader by virtue, a religious spiritual leader by virtue of the moral character traits of the Rebbe. The Rebbe is someone who to emulate, to live, to be like in the way that we live. So that it's not something intellectual, it's the moral and spiritual character traits of the Rebbe that's most important, not the intellectual development of the Rebbe. And secondly, the Hasidic movement actually disagreed with this teaching of Hillel, that an ignorant person cannot truly be a Hasid, a pious person. This was the essence of the movement of Hasidic Judaism, that even a simple unlearned Jew can reach great heights of piety, of good deeds, simply by performing good deeds. The Hasidic teachers taught without highly intellectual learning. Hasidic tales, stories that they told of simple people performing good deeds. They used melodies to sing and inspire simple people to perform good deeds. Prayer, they encouraged prayer, an emotional experience to inspire simple Jews to live a moral life. So that this is the essence of the Hasidic movement. And here, even though I'm not mystical in my orientation, I'm not Hasidic in my orientation, I'm highly rationalistic in my orientation. Nevertheless, in this, regarding this argument, I very much identify with the Hasidic position, which I think is faithful, going back to the Talmudic source, to Rabbi Tarfon. That Rabbi Tarfon says, which is greater, study or good deeds? Good deeds alone, even without intellectual development. It's not really a necessary component of a religious life. Maybe something necessary intellect, maybe something nice intellectual development, but it's not necessary to a religious life. That's the position of Rabbi Tarfon, faithful to the Bible, and it's the position of the Hasidic movement, and that's a position that I also identify with.